This is Dr. Mansoor Madani, Chairman, Department of Oral and Maxillofacial Surgery at Capital Health System in Trenton, New Jersey, and Associate Professor of Oral Maxillofacial Surgery at Temple University, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Welcome back for continuation of a fascinating tale of discovery of pain medication. In part 1, we explained the opium discovery, use and abuse of it, how countries for financial gain imposed importation of opium to China and other nations, and millions of people became addicted purely based on financial greed of individuals or companies and even countries. We discussed who discovered alcohol and how later it was mixed with opium in form of laudanum for consumption, both medicinal and recreational use. We explored discovery of morphine by a 21-year-old man who had no medical background that changed the history of pain management altogether. From that point in early 1800, how codeine and then hypodermic needle were introduced. And ended our first part with the discovery of cocaine and accidental exposure to sulfur mustard gas in 1862. Now we will continue to see how that discovery changed the medical field altogether. This is a fascinating story, and I hope you sit down and listen to this very interesting story. As I said before, in the search for a miracle drug to cure pain, it was sometimes between 1859 to 1860 that a German scientist by the name of Albert Niemann isolated the active ingredient derived from coca leaves for the first time, and he called it cocaine. He died the next year, apparently after his experiment developing sulfur mustard gas. And I mentioned in part 1 that after his death, his colleagues Wilhelm Lawson continued his investigation and identified the exact chemical formula of cocaine in 1862. He did this by dissolving leaves of coca in hydrochloric acid, forming a water-soluble salt, then letting it dry and creating a white powder or crystal. Other German chemists continued their research and discovered how to mass-produce mustard gas. Over 50 years later, mustard gas was used in the World War I, starting in 1915 and beyond. In July 1970, troops based in Ypres in Belgium reported a shimmering cloud around their feet and a strange peppery smell in the air. In 24 hours, they started to itch uncomfortably and developed horrific blisters and sores. Some started coughing up blood. They have been poisoned by mustard gas, one of the deadliest chemical weapons developed in the battle. And because mustard gas can be absorbed through the skin, gas masks were useless. Even fully clothed soldiers weren't fully protected. It could take up to 6 weeks to die from mustard gas, and it was a terrible way to die. Towards the end of the First World War, this gas had not only killed and crippled, but instilled terror across the battlefield. The first use in Ypres alone left up to 10,000 people dead, with many more injured. But the story has much better ending. Albert Einstein once said, "In the middle of difficulty lies opportunities." 2 decades later, with World War II looming, researchers on the side of Allied forces feared a repeat of the mustard gas attack of the Great War, so they tried to create antidote. What they discovered led them into a very different battle. 2 doctors at Yale University, Louis Goodman and Alfred Gilman, started to explore the medical record of soldiers affected by mustard gas and noticed that Many of them had a surprisingly low number of immune cells in their blood, cells that, if mutated, can go on to develop into leukemia and lymphoma. Goodman and Gilman, they came up with an idea. The idea was that if mustard gas could destroy normal white blood cells, it seemed likely that it could also destroy cancer cells. After successful animal trials, Goodman and Gilman looked for a human volunteer with white blood cell cancer to test mustard gas as a cancer therapy. They found a patient with advanced lymphoma, known today only by his initial JD. A massive tumor on JD's jaw meant he couldn't swallow or sleep. He couldn't even fold his arm across his chest because the tumor in the lymph nodes in his armpits were so big. He was wrapped front and back by cancer. His doctor tried everything they could, but his outlook was considered hopeless. With nowhere else to turn, JD agreed to try the new experimental drug. At 10 a.m. on the 27th of August 1942, he was given the first injection of what they called synthetic lymphocidal chemical. This was in fact nitrogen mustard, the compound used to make mustard gas. Because of the war, JD's treatment was a secret, and it was referred to in his record only as a substance X. He received a number of treatments with substance X, and with each one he became a little better. He could sleep, he could swallow, and he could eat. He was much more comfortable, and the pain faded away. This was a monumental moment in the history of medicine. It was the beginning of what we know now as chemotherapy. But far before First World War and Second World War and discovery of chemotherapy, back in 1862, cocaine was hailed as everybody's best friend, cure for all addiction, including opium, laudanum, and morphine. And of course, cocaine was claimed to be not addictive, based on the claim of the makers of cocaine. In that period of time, in 1862, and after discovery and mass production of cocaine, pharmacists of that era marketed cocaine as a miracle drug. In fact, they started selling mixed tablets of cocaine, eucalyptus, and menthol for sore throat. So it happened that cocaine was habit-forming as well, and that's what they discovered later. What could be the next discovery and miracle? It is amazing to think that once upon a time, all of these drugs were legal. Just 120 years ago, you could walk into a pharmacy or department store and buy cocaine, heroin, and morphine for mere sore throat or baby teething. And when you think about how some of these products were advertised, it is very surreal. If your sore throat was bad, you could even get a combo package of cocaine, morphine for sore throat as well. While it is easy to blame patent medicine for the past and American negligence for the start of the early opioid epidemic, the real story is more complicated. It would be a mistake to assume that Victorian-era Americans were just ignorant or just fine with giving infant morphine syrup or cocaine toothache drops. The problem was they just didn't know. Compare that with our knowledge today. We now know the risk and benefit of these substances, but continue to prescribe some powerful narcotic to patients, and in large quantities too. That is the lesson that this course, this continuing education lecture is all about. To stop prescribing irrationally. And as I continued to do more research on this subject, I found out many interesting things. One of them was a French chemist and a marketing genius. His name was Angelo Mariani. He combined ground up coca leaves with red Bordeaux wine, created a popular drink. He called it Vin Mariani in 1863. This cocaine mixture, he claimed, was well liked by the leaders of the entire world, and he had a list of many leaders in his publications. Angelo Mariani even had a seal of approval from the Pope, and in his advertisement he claimed that this wine increases your energy, eliminates your pain, prolongs your life, even approved by the Pope. And His Holiness awarded this product by a golden medal. The most interesting use of cocaine, however, was presented by Dr. John Stitt Pemberton, a slave owner who worked in medicine and fought as a Confederate soldiers in the American Civil War. In the late 19th century, Pemberton, who was struggling with morphine addiction for much of his life, came up with a great idea. Somewhere along the way, his addiction spurred an invention. A new drink. Originally, Pemberton's drink was intended as a medicine. First, he mixed cocaine and wine, called it coca wine. But then later, he added carbonated water. He used 5 ounces of coca leaves per gallon of syrup in the 5 years he owned the company. Then he sold this company to a businessman by the name of Asa Griggs Chandler in 1891, who claimed his formula contained only 0.5 ounces of coca, not 5 ounces. That's 1/10 of the actual coca leaf he was using to create his drink. High amount of cocaine was the secret ingredient. That drink was called Coca-Cola. An incredible marketing tactic was used with beautiful pictures, smart lines and promises. The ideal brain tonic relieves your headache and exhaustion. Coca-Cola, a company that still is in existence, with secret formula kept in a safe in Atlanta, minus the cocaine. Pemberton died of stomach cancer and morphine addiction. About 1887, in University of Berlin, a Romanian chemist named Lazar Edeleniu synthesized a new agent. He called it phenyllyzopropylamine. Later he called it amphetamine. Edeleniu was more interested in oil than stimulant, and he abandoned his research, eventually discovered the modern method of refining crude oil. Interestingly, however, his discovery was not used clinically until Gordon A. Alice resynthesized it in 1920 for the use in medical setting to treat asthma, hay fever, and cold. Around the same time, in 1887, a Japanese organic chemist by the name of Nagayushi isolated the synthesized ephedrine from Ephedra sinica plant. Subsequently, he was able to also synthesize methamphetamine from ephedrine in 1893. Now, amphetamine is used to treat attention deficit disorder or ADHD, narcolepsy, obesity, and sometimes is prescribed off-label for depression and chronic pain. It is important to mention that in 20th century, during World War II, amphetamine and methamphetamine were used extensively by Allied and Axis forces for their stimulant and performance-enhancing effect. As the addictive properties of the drug became known, governments began to place a strict control on the sale of the drug. During the early 1970s, in the United States, amphetamine became a Schedule II controlled substance under the Controlled Substance Act. Despite strict government control, amphetamine and methamphetamine have been used legally or illegally, by individuals from a variety of backgrounds for a variety of purposes. Due to the large underground market for these drugs, they are often illegally synthesized by clandestine chemists, trafficked, and sold on the black market. Methamphetamine started to be known as a speed in the early 1960s. During Vietnam, both the Air Force and Navy made methamphetamine available to aviators. Intermittently, since Vietnam, up to the Desert Storm, the Air Force had used methamphetamine in selected aircraft for specific missions. Among the many celebrated victims of methamphetamine abuse, Johnny Cash, the American singer, survived as he found God. Others were not so lucky, as methamphetamine contributed to death of Judy Garland. Today's possession of amphetamine or methamphetamine without a prescription is illegal in the USA under the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, as they are Schedule II drugs. So far, opium had been used in moderation for centuries to relieve pain, but when distributed widely and used in new and increasingly potent way, millions got addicted. Then laudanum was introduced and discovered as a miracle drink, once again made of diluted opium and alcohol. Morphine was the next one. The mother's friend was the next miracle introduced to mankind, and they claim that morphine not only can provide immediate pain relief, but it can control your opium addiction. And that wasn't true. Then came codeine to relieve cough, diarrhea, once again promoted as a non-addictive drug. Same promises and stories with cocaine. Free samples were even shipped to people. Search for the next miracle drug continued, so chemists and pharmacists, also known as druggists of that period, started to search for better solution, and cocaine was discovered as the next miraculous medicine. Cocaine, everybody's best friend, cure of all addiction, including opium, laudanum, and morphine. And of course, cocaine is not addictive based on the claim of the marketers of cocaine. So it happened that cocaine was habit-forming as well. What could be the next discovery and miracle? Back in 1874, an English chemist, C.R. Wright, synthesized another byproduct of opium. He called it diacetylmorphine. He did that by boiling morphine over a stove. It seemed that once again chemists discovered a new wonder drug. Later he called it heroin. Against a background of increased worry about morphine addiction toward the end of the century, heroin, a new pain-killing morphine derivative, was introduced by Bayer Company in Germany in 1898. It was hailed as an entirely safe preparation, 20 to 25 times more powerful than morphine, and believed to be free of morphine's addictive property, based on as many as 40 medical studies at that time. Because of those supposed research, heroin was recommended for treatment of morphine addiction from 1898 to 1910. Now heroin became the narcotic drug of choice, and its abuse began to spread quickly. Incredibly, the extremely powerful addictive property of heroin, about twice those of morphine, was not recognized until as late as 1910. In 1885, products like heroin cough drops and cocaine-laced toothache medicine were sold openly and freely over the counter using colorful advertisement that can be downright shocking to modern eyes. The German chemical company Bayer offered heroin in 1898 as a cough suppressant. Indeed, heroin was more effective than codeine in respiratory diseases. It turned out, however, that Repeated administration of heroin resulted in development of tolerance, and the patients became heroin addicts too. In 1988, the Bayer Pharmaceutical claimed that its product was well researched and it is more powerful than any other commonly used pain medications. It is cheaper to manufacture, it will last forever, and causes no lingering craving based on their amazing research. It is such a wonderful drug, they claimed, that we offer you free samples. Allowing the same understanding of this new miracle drug, in 1889, St. James Society in the United States also began a campaign to supply free samples of heroin through the mail to morphine addicts who were trying to give up their habits. Opium imports to America also hit their peak in 1890s, right around the rise of abstinence movement, abstinence from alcohol. Perhaps because opiate use was easier to hide than drinking alcohol. The hypodermic syringe set was carried in physicians including Sir Frederick Treves, a surgeon who specialized in abdominal surgery and who supported a then new operation to treat appendicitis, which is still used today. His set included a hypodermic syringe, glass and nickel-plated brass, an aluminum case with velvet purse containing six glass vials of hypodermic medications to include strychnine, nitrate, atropine sulfate, cocaine hydrochloride, and morphine hydrochloride. Treves is perhaps best known as the physician who treated Joseph Merrick, the so-called Elephant Man. The danger of opiates, little was done to discourage its use. Between 1898 and 1902, the opium, morphine, and even cocaine businesses tripled. Interestingly, Sigmund Freud in 1910 recommended cocaine as a cure for everything, from allergies to hay fever, headache, depression, and even sexual impotence, and many more. He died of morphine overdose himself. The rate of addiction was nearly 3 times higher in 1903 than in mid-1990s. New regulation also helped. A state law passed between 1895 and 1915 restricted the sale of opioid to patients only with a valid prescription, ending their availability as over-the-counter drugs. In 1903, heroin addiction rose to an alarming rate. Here in America was a drug that was rapidly creating an underground society of its own. For the first time, a real threat was perceived to the welfare of the population at large, and the response was enactment of legislation designed to attempt to reduce or prevent opiate addiction. 2 years later, in 1905, U.S. Congress Ban Opium. It was in 1906 that the Federal Pure Food and Drug Act required label to specify how much alcohol was contained in a particular medicine, though opium could still be sold in patent medication as long as the phrase habit forming appeared on the label. In 1909, the first federal drug prohibition was introduced. This was America's first war on drug. The law barred the importation of opium for the purpose of smoking. It was passed in preparation for Shanghai Conference, at which the U.S. pressed for legislation aimed at suppressing the sale of opium to China. It wasn't until 1914 that a more comprehensive law, the Harrison Narcotic Act, was introduced. It prohibited opium and morphine as well as cocaine, marijuana, and several other substances from non-prescription preparation and made the possession of opium or its derivative without a prescription a criminal offense. This federal law was designed to regulate and tax the production and distribution of opioids and coca products. At this time, treatment for the rehabilitation of opioid addicts began on an organized basis. Back in 1914, during the First World War, stores sold narcotic gift sets containing syringes, needles, and tubes of cocaine and heroin. The only thing you needed to do to have a prescription from your doctor, which was easy to get. This was promoted as a present for friends on the front line of the war. Injectable gift to make life in the trenches more bearable and alleviate the horror of the war. During the Spanish flu of 1918, when over 500 million people got infected worldwide and over 50 million people lost their lives, narcotics of any type were used commonly to relieve the pain and suffering of infected patients. In 1923, the U.S. Treasury Department's Narcotic Division, the first federal drug agency, banned all legal narcotic sales, now including heroin and cocaine. With the prohibition of the legal venue to purchase heroin, addicts were forced to buy from illegal street dealers. Let me just pause here and fast forward 100 years later to current time, the 21st century. What happened after all those advertising and marketing of the past? All the laws that have been passed, all the regulation, did they stop the use and abuse of heroin? The answer is not at all. Over 1 million Americans may be addicted to heroin right now. It is often mixed with other substances such as sugar, starch, or even poison strychnine. As we'll see later, it has been mixed with carfentanil, the most powerful opioid derivatives that a small pebble size of it makes an elephant unconscious. In some cases, imported illegally from China. Currently, among people younger than 26, heroin is linked to more death than any other substance except alcohol. Heroin injection is linked to 1/3 of HIV cases and more than 1/2 of hepatitis C cases. I will talk in future presentation about narcotic addictions and cocaine addiction in particular in future lectures. But a morphine shortage during the World War II created a problem. To combat that shortage, in 1937, German scientists Max Buckmull and Gustav Erhard were able to isolate a new drug, another miracle drug, methadone. They were searching for a painkiller that would be easier to use during surgery with less addictive potential than morphine or heroin. However, methadone was later abandoned after adverse side effects became apparent with high dosage. Methadone was even more addictive than heroin. Despite that knowledge, the American pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly later began to produce methadone in 1947. A few years later, in the 1950s, methadone was used to treat opioid addicts. And later in the 1960s, Dr. Vincent Dole of Rockefeller University also recommended methadone to combat heroin addiction. However, methadone became controversial in 1973 when critics claimed the treatment exchanged one addiction to another despite the fact that the dosage of methadone was minimal and controlled by medical professionals. Controversy led to strict government control over methadone, which remains in place today. Despite all those controversies and government control, methadone is still being used today to treat heroin addicts. So after the disappointment with opium, methadone, heroin, and even morphine as reliable and supposedly not non-addictive painkiller, the search continued for alternatives that might not have the addictive purposes, looking for the next miracle drug. So in 1938, Otto Eisleb, a German chemist who was looking for a synthetic substitute for atropine, discovered a new product. It had significant analgesic effect as morphine-like property. He called it meperidine or Demerol. Thus, a byproduct of an unrelated investigation, became the first completely synthetic pain-relieving drugs with an activity comparable to that of morphine. Like heroin 40 years earlier, it seems initially to have promise and miraculous. Shortly after, however, it was recognized that Demerol could cause addiction as well. If you look now under description of this drug, you will see this label. High risk of addiction and dependence, can cause respiratory distress and death when taken in high doses or when combined with other substances, especially alcohol. In fact, if anything, the new class of synthesized painkiller have been seen as more dangerous than any that have existed in nature, because the effect can be felt after unbelievably minute quantities. A case in point is synthetic drug called etorphin, that is 5,000 to 10,000 times more powerful than morphine and relieves pain with a dose of as low as 1/10,000th of a gram. There is no question that a substance of this type would be extremely addictive and dangerous. While scientists in Germany and America started studying amphetamine's stimulant effect. As I mentioned earlier, amphetamine, which later sold as Benzedrine, was discovered 60 years earlier, and subsequent synthesis of methamphetamine was also discovered by the Japanese chemist Nagai Nagayushi. But it was not until now that it came into widespread use. It turned out that amphetamine is a pretty effective decongestant. When inhaled, nasal passages and lung cleared up, but this drug had another effect. It wasn't to stay slim or fit, but a surprising new reason with military value. 1932, Smith, Kline, and French started selling an inhaler they called Benzedrine. Unlike a modern asthma inhaler, Benzedrine inhaler didn't rely on pressurized canister filled with medications. Rather, they contained a cotton strip soaked in amphetamine oil. But how about the stimulating effect? By the mid-1930s, newly available Benzedrine salt were put in pills and prescribed for sleep disorder, depression, and weight loss. As America geared up for the Second World War, the pill showed promises as a weapon too. Soon Benzedrine could be found on the battlefield. Hundreds of thousands of packets of 5 milligram pill were issued to soldiers by field medics. The US, British, German, Japanese armies used amphetamine and methamphetamine as a stimulant to stay awake and alert during Second World War. It was hard to sleep while under, say, artillery fire, and soldiers often had to shelter in inclement condition. As the war progressed, more and more military members suffered from significant sleep deprivation. Benzedrine kept them awake, alert, and ready to fight during battle, even without the luxury of a good night's sleep. By 1970, 5% of Americans, at least 9.7 million, used prescription amphetamines, and 3.2 million were addicted to amphetamine. In 1970, with the passage of Controlled Substance Act, amphetamine became a Schedule III drug. A year later, it was classified as a Schedule II drug, a drug with high potential for abuse, and with continued use, it could potentially lead to severe psychological and physical dependence based on classification of Class II Schedule drug. Today, opioids like Vicodin and fentanyl, part of the modern epidemic of legally prescribed drugs, share a Schedule II status with amphetamine. Once again, despite all the regulations and laws passed and based on CDC report, approximately 1.6 million people, 0.6% of the population in 2017, were still using methamphetamine annually. Many by prescription for conditions such as ADHD in form of Adderall and narcolepsy, but many also used it illegally. Amphetamine sulfate or speed is used for recreational and non-medical purposes as well. On the other hand, during 1965 to 1970s, U.S. involvement in Vietnam was blamed for the surge in illegal heroin being smuggled into the state. The number of heroin addicts in the United States reached an estimated 750,000 people. Meanwhile, in 1970, Freebase Cocaine was introduced in the US as well. By dissolving cocaine in ether or ammonia, removing hydrochloride, the purest form of cocaine was created, the most potent, most addictive, and deadliest form of cocaine. Pablo Escobar started to import high-grade cocaine to the United States. Pablo Escobar was a Colombian drug lord and narco-terrorist who was the founder and sole leader of the Medellin cartel. Dubbed as the King of Cocaine, Escobar was the wealthiest criminal in history with an estimated net worth of US $30 billion by the time of his death in 1993, while his drug cartel monopolized the cocaine trade into the United States in the 1980s and 1990s. The term war on drug entered the public consciousness in 1971 when President Nixon repeated the statement again and again, war on drug, featuring a press conference and an anti-drug message to the Congress. Nixon stated that drug abuse was worse than communism and called the drug public enemy number one. Drugs, however, brought Elvis Presley and Nixon together. In an incident that became a famous photo op, singer Elvis Presley met President Nixon in the Oval Office in 1970. Elvis had asked for a badge from the Bureau of Narcotic and Dangerous Drug, which later merged with other federal offices to become the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. Elvis allegedly wanted the narcotic badge so he could bring his narcotic slash along his travels. Elvis died at age 42 in 1977 from complication of drug overdose. Although in the 1950s heroin addiction was known among jazz musicians but still fairly uncommon among average Americans, many of whom saw it as a frightening condition, the fear extended into 1960s and even 1970s, although it became common to hear or read about drugs such as cannabis and psychedelics, which were widely used at rock concerts like Woodstock. In 1970s disco scene, the club drug of choice shifted to the stimulant drug cocaine and the depressant drug Quaaludes. Quaaludes were so common at disco club that the drug was nicknamed Disco Biscuit. Heroin addiction began to make the news around 1970 when rock star Janis Joplin died from an accidental heroin overdose. On July 1st, 1973, President Nixon created the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, under the Justice Department to consolidate virtually all federal power of drug enforcement in a single agency. In future presentation, I will discuss various DEA classification and the drug list is in each class category. Starting in 1975 and until 1978, the search for a new source of raw opium shifted. A new heroin highway developed, shifting from China White which was a mixture of fentanyl and heroin, to Mexican mud, a darker color black tar heroin, to Atlanta snow, obviously the purest form of heroin. The reason for the halt of the original heroin highway was that in 1978, the US and Mexican government found a means of eliminating the source of the raw opium by spraying poppy field with Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a herbicide and defoliate chemical that causes the leaves of plants to fall off. It was one of the so-called tactical use rainbow herbicides. Agent Orange is widely known for its use by the US military as part of its chemical warfare program, Operation Ranch Hand, during the Vietnam War from 1961 to 1971. That eradication plan was successful as the amount of Mexican mud in the US drug market declined. But that was just one country and a temporary halt. In response to the decrease in availability of Mexican mud, another source of heroin was found in the Golden Crescent area of Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, creating a dramatic upsurge in the production and trade of illegal heroin. Meanwhile, during 1980s, a new form of cocaine was concocted. They took cocaine and mixing it with baking soda, which is sodium bicarbonate, then adding water. Once heated, a pure form of cocaine was generated, and they called it crack cocaine. On cooling, rocks were precipitated, hence called crack cocaine, and these are smoked in crack pipes or are heated on foil with vapor inhaled. And in 1982, a popular comedian, John Belushi of Animal House, died of an overdose of heroin and cocaine combination known as speedball. In 1992, Colombian drug lord El Chapo introduced a high-grade form of heroin into the United States, creating a major epidemic of drug addiction in US. His history is interesting too. J. Guzman, also known as El Chapo, started working in the Mexican poppy field at age 9. He rose to become the head of Sinaloa cartel and the most powerful drug lord in the world. Same story with Pablo Escobar, who built such vast fortune on the back of people's addiction. Looking back at history once again, power, greed, and corruption caused devastation, loss of life, and major damage to the economies all around the world. I always say that we cannot blame Pablo Escobar and El Chapo alone. Many of drug addiction during this period started with medical and dental practitioners over prescribing narcotic to patient, as I'll explain in future presentations. In October of 1993, heroin took another well-known victim. 23-year-old actor River Phoenix died of heroin and cocaine overdose, the same speedball combination that had killed comedian John Belushi. Next is the history of discovery of oxymorphone and hydrocodone and other derivatives of morphine. They go back at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1914, a German scientist discovered oxymorphone. It was patented in 1955 and approved for medical use in 1959. Oxymorphone was sold under the brand name New Morphine and Opana, among others. In June 2017, the FDA asked Endo Pharmaceutical to remove its product from the US market. Opana was linked to outbreak of HIV, hepatitis C, and serious blood disorder. It was the first time that FDA had taken a step to remove a currently marketed opioid pain medication from sale due to the public health consequences of abuse. This product had caused acceleration of the opioid epidemic, but a 2012 reformulation failed to stop illicit injection of the drug. Endo Pharmaceutical responded by voluntarily removing Opana ER from the market a month later. Generic version of extended release oxymorphone are still available in the United States. In 1920, German scientists Karl Monick and Helen Lowenheim synthesized hydrocodone. It was received FDA approval for sale in the United States in 1943. Hydrocodone was first marketed by Kohl as Dicodid starting in February of 1924 in Germany. And they had many other products that they were introducing at that time. Dilaudid, Dinarcon, which was Oxycodone, Dihydrine, which was dihydrocodone, and dimorphine or dihydromorphine. In 1934, a researcher for the U.S. Bureau of Social Hygiene reported that although hydrocodone is an excellent painkiller and cough suppressant, users build up a tolerance very slowly, inducing them to become addicted. Vicodin or hydrocodone combination with acetaminophen or Tylenol. In 2009, a federal advisory panel recommended that Vicodin, one of the most popular and glamorous prescription painkiller marketed heavily since 1978, be banned from the market. In addition to hydrocodone, Vicodin contained acetaminophen or Tylenol, which could cause liver damage when consumed in large doses. 85 years earlier, in 1893, acetaminophen, a byproduct of coal tar distillation, was introduced for the first time as a pain medicine. In 1955, acetaminophen was introduced to the United States under the name Tylenol. I should add here that although acetaminophen was one of the very first non-narcotic medications synthesized in 1893, aspirin also was synthesized and manufactured in 1899. But before that, salicylic acid has been used medicinally since antiquity. Medicine made from willows and other salicylate-rich plants appear in clay tablets from ancient Sumer as well as ancient Egypt. Hippocrates refers to the use of salicylic tea to reduce fever around 400 BC, and willow bark extract became recognized for its specific effect on fever, pain, and inflammation in the mid-18th century. By the 19th century, pharmacists were experimenting with the prescription of a variety of chemicals related to salicin, the active component of willow extract. By 2002, emergency room admission involving hydrocodone problem increased 500% since 1990. That same year, the FDA recommended tighter warning on drug containing acetaminophen over liver damage fear. Due to massive marketing of Kohl Pharma in 2006, 130 million Vicodin was prescribed annually by doctors. On June 30, 2009, a federal advisory panel voted to recommend the FDA ban of Vicodin. Looking back at the history of drug discovery, let's explore one of the most recent medication that contributed significantly to drug addiction in US. That drug is Oxycodone. Oxycodone was developed in 1917 in Germany, synthesized from thebaine, an opioid alkaloid found in the Persian poppy, also known as the Iranian poppy or the great scarlet poppy. Oxycodone is the synthetic cousin to morphine, but 1.5 to 2 times more powerful than morphine. It became available for use in United States in 1939. While thebaine is not used therapeutically, its main alkaloid extract from Papaver bracteatum or Persian poppy, can be converted into a variety of compounds, including hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, oxymorphone, naloxone, and many more. Now, as the 20th century was coming to a close, another fascinating story emerged. A new era in marketing, a new story of power, greed, and corruption with lethal ending. This part began in early 1990. Doctors were not writing that much opioids. An international panel of pain specialists, including physician and health policy scholars, met to discuss the impact of the fear of opioid on the clinical use of these strong analgesic. Recognizing potential risk from opioids, the panel member concluded that the fact that practitioners are afraid to write pain medications is an irrational fear, and used a term of opiophobia. But this was a great news for Purdue Pharma, a privately held company based in Stamford, Connecticut, which had developed a prescription strength Oxycontin. Upon release of Oxycontin in 1995, it was hailed as a medical breakthrough, a new miracle drug, a long-lasting narcotic that could help patients suffering from moderate to severe pain. This miracle drug was being introduced, but from the beginning, it was known to be addictive if not used properly. Under a marketing strategy that Arthur Sackler had pioneered a decade earlier, the company aggressively pressed doctors to prescribe the drug, wooing them and pursuing them with free trips to pain management seminar and paid speaking engagement. Sale soared. The drug was marketed as smooth and sustained pain control all day and all night, when taken on a 12-hour schedule, and as having lower abuse potential than immediate release oxycodone because of its time release properties, even though there was no scientific evidence backing that conclusion, and the addictive nature of opioids had been known for many years prior to that. In these early years, Purdue Pharma was aware of Oxycontin's abuse, including reports that the pill were being crushed and snorted, stolen from pharmacies, and that some doctors were being charged with selling prescription. Their marketing strategy surely got lots of people high. In 2007, the maker of Oxycontin admitted that they misled the public and paid a fine of only $634 million. Another drug that was FDA approved in 1950 was Percodan, a combination of oxycodone and aspirin. Problem of abuse began in early 60s and is still going on. I will discuss this in much detail in future segment of this series of presentation. Now I want to ask a quiz from my audience. Looking at this slide, which one of these narcotics you believe is the most powerful narcotic? I will read these slowly so you can guess which one. Fentanyl, morphine, oxymorphone, heroin, or carfentanil. Powerful narcotic is carfentanil at this time. Carfentanil was first synthesized in 1974 by a team of chemists at Janssen Pharmaceutical, which included Paul Janssen. Carfentanil is a structural analog of synthetic opioid analgesic fentanyl, but a lot more powerful, possibly 1,000 times more powerful than fentanyl, and 10,000 times more powerful than morphine. But they did not discover it for human use. It was for use in veterinary medicine. It is used for anesthetizing large animals, including elk and elephant, in form of tranquilizing dart. Fortunately, carfentanil has been mixed with heroin to make a potent combination called the Grey Death. It is imported illegally and mostly from China, and is less expensive and easier to be obtained by narcotic suppliers. The risk of death obviously is a lot more when the heroin is contaminated with carfentanil. Finally, most stories have a great ending, but this subject does not, and I want to finish this presentation with a sad ending. It was year 2002. Humanity entered yet a new war using opioid as weapon again. It happened in Russia during the Moscow theater hostage crisis. The crisis occurred only 13 months after 9/11, when the United States and some other Western countries were engaged in their own extraordinary action to combat the terrorist threat. 40 Chechnyan fighters seized Moscow's movie theater, and more than 800 hostages placed explosives around the theater and threatened to destroy it and kill every single hostage unless Russia agrees to end its military campaign in Chechnya. After several days of unsuccessful negotiation and the Chechens threatened that they will start killing hostages, Russian security forces pumped an aerosolized combination of 2 fentanyl analogs into the theater to incapacitate the inhabitants and permit the building to be stormed. The terrorists and approximately 130 of the hostages were killed. Traditionally, tear gas compels an unprotected person to flee the area, but this time a special vaporized narcotic was used, a potent form of fentanyl, an aerosolized mist of carfentanil and remifentanil, incapacitating agent with direct effect on the central nervous system to subdue Chechens hostage takers. The Moscow emergency services had not been informed of the use of those agents, but were instructed to bring opioid antagonists. Not knowing to expect hundreds of patients exposed to high dose of carfentanil, the emergency workers did not bring enough naloxone or naltrexone, the 2 most commonly used opioid antagonists, to counteract the carfentanil and remifentanil and save the lives of many of the victims. 130 people, as I said, exposed to the aerosol used in the rescue attempt were confirmed to have died from both respiratory failure and aerosol inhalation during the incident. So after listening to me for the last 2 hours, what lessons we can learn from the history to combat today's drug addiction? If we only look at the 1890s and 1990s, we can find a common but ill-informed and misleading information about the benefit of opioids. In 1890, we can say that they were ill-informed when Bayer offered free heroin, a miracle drug to treat morphine addicts. And that many years later, other companies offered their miracle medicine, such as Methadone, Demerol, amphetamine, and of course cocaine. During all those times, and with the discovery of every single drug, they claimed safety and non-habit forming of those potions. Well, they were misinformed and did not know any better. Then in 1990s, well-informed pharmaceutical companies such as Purdue, knowingly about the significant potential of abuse and addiction, marketed their miracle drug Oxycodone. Of course, it is easy to blame pharmaceutical industries as they carry the greatest burden of responsibility. But one can easily put the blame on physicians as well as the governmental regulators who spectacularly fail to protect the public. If we don't focus at our own behaviors, this won't be the last time opioid infest our society. One doctor wrote in the Journal of Medical Association in 1915 that I'm convinced that if we were to select, say, half a dozen of the most important drugs in the Encyclopedia of Pharmacy, we should all place opium in the first rank. Decade later, in 1980, a 5-sentence 101-word letter in the New England Journal of Medicine concluded incorrectly that a study of thousands of inpatient cases showed that the development of opioid addiction is rare in medical patients with no history of addiction. That letter would be cited hundreds of times to make more false claims about opioids. Purdue Pharma used that 101-word letter to build an empire and got millions of people addicted. Unless we learn from the past, it is certain that the wheels of time will keep churning and this tragedy will continue. I hope that you enjoyed this fascinating history of opioid discoveries, both part 1 and part 2, and I look forward to continue discussions on pain management in future.